Be primarily reading off of a script for this one because there's a lot involved in this, and I tend to ramble, so I will be keeping myself a little more focused than usual, for those of you who know me. So without further ado, though, let's go ahead and get started. All about reflections, calamities, and worlds we have been and worlds we are going in Final Fantasy XIV. Hi all, I'm Elioaux Forgerau, and I'll be your panel host for the next 90 or so minutes. Today we're going to be covering the over, under, and sideways of reflections, calamities, rejoinings, and frankly more Lalafell than I'm sure any of us were expecting going into 7.0. And if we have time, we might speculate on what we could see in the near future of Final Fantasy XIV, based on this and other recent information that we've acquired in Dawntrail. So, a quick who am I? I'm a lore content creator who makes videos and streams over on the Eorzean Archives YouTube channel, though for health reasons I've been away for a few months. And I've been a player since Stormblood. In short, I have not been playing long enough to have seen a bard use a healer limit break, but have been playing long enough to remember the pain of TP and when belts still held up our pants. At this time, I want to warn you that we will be covering information up to the end of Dawntrail MSQ, so if you are not caught up on 7.0, you have been warned. I'm guessing most of you guys have played through 7.0 at this point. Okay. First off, what is a reflection? So, okay, if you have played the MSQ, you've been told a number of times from a number of people, but to put it simply, a reflection is a shard and mirrored alternate reality of the star we know as Hydaelyn and what the ancients called Aetheris. Even post 6.0, some NPC use one name and some use the other, and some on other continents like Tyrol and in Othard use a completely different name for the star altogether, so either Hydaelyn or Aetheris, any of them are still completely fine to use. The reflections were brought about when the star was sundered by the primal Hydaelyn into the source and its 13 reflections. These reflections have a natural pull back to the source, but are prevented from doing so by a barrier that exists between them. One moment. Had a bit of thunderstorm start out of nowhere. Okay, so the way the reflections were created was when Hydaelyn struck and sundered the primal Zodiarch and the star. All of this was in an attempt to prevent the Ascians from committing a mass genocide in order to restore their loved ones who had given their bodies up to create Zodiarch. When the sundering blow was dealt to the star, Aetheris was split across 14 overlapping planes of reality, the source and its reflections 1 through 13. Each of which share a relative proximity to each other based on their number. The 1st and 13th being closest neighbors to the source, and also places we've already been to in the game. Note that they don't actually exist in a literal sense next to each other, or in a banded proximity, but it's more like they all share the same physical space, or the same share space in the Sea of Stars, but are more or less shifted dimensionally, with some being nearer to others that in that dimensional displacement. Each reflection mimics the source in various ways, from its peoples to its geographies, but all have gone through their own history lasting roughly about 12,000 years. The exact length of each reflection's history is a little up in the air because the temporal relationship between each reflection is not consistent, but we'll talk a little bit more on that later. What is a calamity? You can't explain reflections without also explaining a side effect of their existence with calamities and rejoinings. In both cases, these are brought about by an Ascian in an attempt to return the world to how it used to be by reuniting all 14 shards of the star into one whole. The calamities being a part of the process of rejoining. Calamities are, like the name implies, an extreme elemental charge cataclysmic event that takes place on the source, when the energies from a reflection are tilted so far in a direction that the barrier between reflection and source cracks, and the energies all come sweeping in at once. The calamity itself is elementally charged to one of 6 elements: fire, water, wind, earth, ice, or electric, or one of 2 poles, the polar charge of umbral and astral. Umbral being stasis, astral being change. The reflections themselves suffer from a similar rising tide of elements, examples being the flood of umbral light on the 1st or astral darkness on the 13th. The aligned aether of the source and or a reflection is tilted so strongly towards one affinity like wind or water that the barrier between worlds cracks, and then with the help of a major event on the source, shatters, and the energies come pouring into the source, and all of the reflection's aether is rejoined to the star as a massive elemental event takes place. That is what we know as a calamity. Of which there have been 7. Or, well, 8, depending on if you want to count alternate timelines, but I'm going to be talking mainly about our timeline, of which the most recent calamity is the 7th Umbral Calamity, that took place with the fall of Dalamud and the releasing of Bahamut after 5,000 years of imprisonment, and who rained astral hellfire down upon Eorzea and brought an end to the 6th Astral Era and to the 1.0 version of the game. Calamities have such a profound impact on the world that it's historically how people on Hydaelyn even measure eras of time. The pattern of a calendar matches the cadence of calamities in a cycle. It starts with an umbral calamity that is then followed by a brief period of chaos lasting anywhere from a few to 200 years, which is known as an umbral era. Then there's an indeterminate period of time after things have settled down and peace is generally restored, called an astral era, which can last for any length of time, but usually between 1 to 2,000 years. Eventually, another umbral calamity takes place, and so on and so forth. With calamities ostensibly a thing of the past, it's possible this system may fall out of use, but for all intents and purposes, it's currently the first decade of the 7th Astral Era as of Dawntrail. When it comes to a more objective view on time post-Sundering, we have prehistory, which begins about 12,000 years ago. Things are chaotic and events like the creation of the 12 and the Omphalos take place. At some point after that, Midgard Summer arrives on our star and makes a pact with Hydaelyn, and in return is granted a home for his brood and their children. At some point in prehistory, the Ascians as an organization come into being and begin to seek ways to rejoin all the reflections and restore their paradise. Their initial attempts at rejoining ends in failure due to not understanding enough about how the entire process works, leading to the 13th reflection of Hydaelyn becoming the Void after it's flooded with darkness. The fate of the 13th may actually be the same fate that befell the 9th reflection, known as the Unlost World, as the description of the Rising Levin energies and the Storm Surge War sure do sound a lot like the process done to other reflections to prepare them for rejoining. It's possible that, unlike with the 13th, however, the issue here was not a lack of knowledge, but a lack of Ascians being still around to actually take advantage of the plans they had laid. Where they messed up on the 13th is that to cause a rejoining, you have to have a major event on the source ready to go to help crack the barrier between it and the reflections. It isn't enough to just tilt a reflection towards an alignment. Example of major events that allowed for a rejoining being the fall of Dalamud for the 7th Umbral Calamity, or the Crystal Tower diverting energy into the Earth for the 4th Umbral Calamity that was a massive earthquake. The period of time between the Sundering and the first actual rejoining lasts roughly 2,000 years, and the exact relationship of when each event happened in relationship to each other is vague. But what we do know is that after these events, the first Umbral Calamity and first rejoining take place. I'm going to go through the order of calamities, but one thing I want to make clear is that despite the fact that there is one calamity for each element and one for each polarity, there is no in-universe explanation of why they are, or even that they must be ordered that way. Would a 9th calamity have restarted the order? Would the final 13th rejoining stop midway in the cycle? Perhaps it was about keeping the elements on the source stabilized? We don't know, and frankly, I just think Emet-Selch, as per usual, was being a bit of a drama queen and liked symmetry. Note here you will see the order of the calamities. First calamity was wind, 2nd lightning, 3rd fire, 4th earth, 5th ice, 6th water, 7th astral. Not super important that you need to remember that, but it's good to know, and we'll be going over that again in 1 second here. By first talking about the calamity of wind. The first Umbral Calamity was the element of wind, and the world was blasted by tempestuous hurricanes devastating vast swaths of Eorzea, and presumably the rest of Hydaelyn. It's ambiguous the level to which all calamities affect areas outside of Eorzea. We know that they often do, but to what extent is not always known. We only know the first calamity's element for sure, thanks to the process of elimination of the other 5 elements as of the 6th calamity, and strangely enough, thanks to a bunch of Mughal legends. The first Umbral Calamity may have taken place roughly 10,000 years ago, It depends on parity of the source's time with the 13ths, but like I said, we won't worry too much about time. The second calamity was the element of lightning, characterized in the source by a year of darkened skies and unceasing lightning strikes. I'd like to point out again the similarities to the described fate of the ninth reflection, and even some of its legacy and heritage found. However, the ninth reflection is not the reflection rejoined during the second calamity, as we know for a fact it was the 12th reflection that was rejoined during the second umbral calamity, thanks to Encyclopedia Eorzea Volume 1. Also, the fact that the ninth reflection was never rejoined. More on that in a little bit. Actually, more on that I think in a second year. Additionally, the ninth reflection was not rejoined, and we know this because when living memory is powered down, you can see the daytime sky above as well as the moon at night. When a rejoining happens, the moon is specifically rejoined, as all moons on, well, at least the energy within it is, as all moons on each reflection are an artificial construct crafted by Hydaelyn to house a shard of Zodiark's aether. Though it may have suffered a surge of Levin energy, somewhat like the 13th suffered a surge of darkness, or the first suffered a surge of light aether, the ninth was never rejoined. We don't actually know how long ago the second calamity took place, since there really aren't many records of that time. The one certainty we have is that it is between 10,000 and 6,000 years ago. The third calamity is similar, where we don't exactly know when it took place, but what we do know is its element was fire. The sun increased in intensity, baking the land, reducing verdant forests to desert wastelands. There's even some theories that places like Hydaelyn may have, before the third umbral calamity, been a more like tropical rainforest or a jungle. However, Amarang would kind of suggest that that's not the case if the topography of the reflections are that level of mirrored. The first calamity that we know a lot about, both in its effects and how it came to pass, and when it took place, is the fourth calamity, which was the element of Earth. And it happened about 5,000 years ago at the very end of the Allagan Empire. The cause was Emperor Xande drawing too much energy into the Crystal Tower and redirecting that energy into the ground, causing mass earthquakes across the world as far away as Zadnor and Ilsabard, and even swallowing up the Crystal Tower underground completely, only to rise again after the seventh umbral calamity took place. This is also the period of time in which a lot of other future problems came to be, via people like Amon or Allag messing with Omega, and various other things, although really that's less about the period of time and just frankly the fault of Allag. Usually you can blame Allag. Actually, you pretty much can always either blame the Ancients or Allag in some way for every problem in all of this game. I guess you could also just say Allag is the fault of the Ancients as well, but oh, Emetzelk. Okay. The fifth calamity element was ice, the stars slowly growing colder, and the seas and oceans froze solid, like the Blood Brine Sea, which is north of Eorzea, and the Southern Isle Seas, which are southeastish. We know the fifth calamity took place somewhere between 5,000 and 2,000 years ago. This is also the time when Mikote traveled across the Blood Brine into Eorzea from Ilsabard, once it had frozen over, and when the first people of the South Sea Isles disappeared from Aloalo, having used a crystal, praying fervently to a crystal that opened a gateway that led them to the ninth reflection, the Unlost World. That crystal is going to come back up later. If you've played 7.0.0, you've definitely dealt with the fallout of that crystal quite a bit, as it is the one inside the key. Speaking of Lalafell, they had a big role to play in the sixth calamity as well, whose element was water, and was an indirect result of the War of the Magi between Amdapor and Mach, taking place about 1,600 years before the events of A Realm Reborn. The waters of the oceans swelled, and raging tsunamis hit all over the coastlines of the world. Most people retreated to higher ground or were forced into desperate acts like the creation of the Void Ark, the teleportation of Nyankrump's Hope, or even an army of spellcasting Nimians giving their lives to hold tidal waves at bay to allow their clansmen time to flee. And I will tell you, it is one of my favorite stories, just random side stories in 14, is the little bits of lore that they create sometimes. But the fact that a bunch of Nimians basically gave their lives to cast magic nets to hold back water just to give their fellow people time to escape the floods is, gotta love Lalafell sacrificial. uh, act. Okay. And sort of last, but not by any means least, we have the seventh umbral calamity and its elements, or, well, more accurately, its polarity of astrality. Basically, a calamity of change and corruptive energy, which took place 5 years ago, supposedly. We've been operating in a bit of a time bubble since A Realm Reborn, with it being anywhere from 2 to 4 years from the start of the 7th Astral Era at the end of A Realm Reborn to Dawntrail. Something we can only vaguely place thanks to Ella's in puberty. For the longest time, that has actually been true. Lately, though, things have changed a bit. Yoshi P has stated more recently that at the end of 6.0, 2 to 2.5 years had passed, likely passed since A Realm Reborn. And also later on, at a different point, mentioned that roughly 6 months had passed between 6.0 and 6.1. So I'm going to be using 3 years as a good benchmark, and there's some other further evidence to back that up. You can look at some of the other claims from certain characters in 7.0 about certain other events and their co-relationship to each other, but all you have to take for is that 3 years is a good ballpark for how long it's been since either the end of A Realm Reborn or the start of the Realm Reborn. Somewhere in there. Anyways, the Seventh Umbral Calamity took place when Bahamut broke free of Dalamud and fired his mega flares all across the land, creating the astrally charged crystal structures that litter Eorzea, as well as the massive geographical change to the land between 1.0 and 2.0. For any of those you've seen or played 1.0, you know that there was quite a lot of geographic upheaval between the version of 1.0 and A Realm Reborn. There is also technically the Eighth Umbral Calamity, whose polarity was umbral, basically a lack of flow and change, like we see in the first. And it happened never, except always, sometimes. Look, timelines are a lot when it comes to Final Fantasy XIV. In an alternate timeline, the gas known as Black Rose went off, stilling the aether of a vast amount of living things on the star, resulting in all sorts of bad outcomes, and it led to Grahatia of that timeline taking the Crystal Tower from that timeline to the first reflection in our timeline, in order to stop the flood of light that enabled Black Rose. Thanks to this short story in Unpromised Tomorrow, we know that the Eighth Emerald timeline still exists, but it may never be relevant. May. Vanaz seems to know from our stories in Elpis that the Eighth Umbral timeline came to pass, which is how she knew to tell Arbert not to sacrifice himself, because it wasn't his time and he'd be needed later. But also, she could have only been in the position to have been told by us in the past in Elpis if she had already told Arbert to wait. And okay, this is not a panel on time travel, let's just move along. All we have talked about so far is mainly the history of the source. The histories of the other reflections get more complicated. When it comes to time on each reflection, it seems that they can go in and out of sync with the source. For example, a few months to a max year equating to 100 years between Arbert leaving the source during 3.4 and when we arrive on the first, or a few days in Tural equating to 3 decades beneath the dome of Heritage Found. The 13th seems to either have the same frame of reference as the source, with it being 10,000 years since the 13th's fall to darkness, both on the source and on the 13th, or it may be that all reflections over a long enough period of time do run in sync with each other. What is clear is that once they connect to each other in a meaningful enough way, it seems to lock them in synchronicity, if only for a time, like we see with the first and source. Think Vanguard's creation in Yassulani, breaking the dome open to the source and bringing their temporality in sync with ours, or the convenient, permanent Warrior of Light-shaped hole that the Exarch created to connect the source and first. Void gates probably don't cause the same syncing, since they're more like temporary rifts in space and are present both on the first and source, and void gates have existed for thousands of years on the source, like in Ozol's Legacy. But the Gate of the Skydeep Cenote has been around for hundreds of years and did not bring us in synchronicity with the ninth reflection. The Gate of Remembrance being the way that we access living memory during 7.0. But let's hop back a bit and talk about rejoinings a little more in particular. Rejoinings are an act of dimensional compression and the underlying desired outcome for why calamities happen, or, well, more accurately, are caused by the Ascians. When a reflection is tilted towards an elemental alignment and the source is tipped in a similar chaotic direction, they start to pull towards each other. When both are at their zenith of elemental and etheric disruption, if a cataclysmic event takes place, it shatters the natural barrier between reflection and source that prevents them from returning together. And which prevents them from returning together cracks, which allows the mirrored reality, all its people and places, to break a hole in the barrier and be drawn into our world. Their aether joining to the source and merging with the ethereal sea. Rejoining some, if not all, the sundered souls with missing parts from the absorbed star. To be very clear, it is a genocide, and not only ending a world, but its history, its lands and traditions, and all of its people forever. There is another outcome of an attempted rejoining, as we mentioned earlier. If the source is not also brought to the brink, and only the reflection is etherically misaligned, a mass amount of the associated aether will spread out across the reflection, damaging and tilting it towards said aspect, to a degree that all life is either ended or corrupted, like we see in the 13th, which had been tipped so far towards darkness, which is naturally astral, that a flood of darkness swept across every corner of the reflection, corrupting its people, turning them into void scent, and leaving it in ruin. In the first, a similar but oppositely aligned umbral flood of light was halted altogether, thanks to the sacrifices of Minfilia and of Ardbert and his crew. As a quick sidebar to all of this, light is umbrally aligned and darkness is astrally aligned. They are not, however, synonyms. Dark is naturally astral and prone to change and growth. Light, naturally tilted towards umbral and prone to stasis and tranquility. You can, however, have astral light and umbral darkness, as astral and umbral are poles of change and stasis themselves, not elemental alignments. Elements even have tendencies, like fire, lightning, and wind being prone to astrality, and water, earth, and ice being prone to umbrality. But you can still have something like umbral fire, which would be a dry heat rather than a searing flame. You can also tell that the top three elements on the elemental chart, wind, lightning, and fire, tilted towards astrality, and the bottom three, water, ice, and earth, tilted towards umbrality. So, that's calamities and rejoinings and time shenanigans, but what reflections are actually left? 7 calamities means 7 were already rejoined to the source. They were the 5th shard, which was rejoined during the calamity of wind, the 12th shard, which was rejoined during the calamity of lightning, the 2nd shard, which was rejoined during the calamity of fire, the 3rd shard, which is rejoined during the calamity of earth, the 6th shard, which was rejoined during the calamity of ice, the 10th shard, which was rejoined during the calamity of water, and the 7th shard, which was conveniently rejoined during the calamity of astrality. We know this thanks to Encyclopedia Eorzea Volume 1 in specific. So, what does that leave us with? The 1st, 4th, 8th, 9th, 11th, and 13th, of which the 1st, 13th, and now 9th are all accounted for. Important note that other than the 7th, there doesn't seem to be any connection between the number and order of being rejoined, with the 13th being the first attempted to be rejoined, and the 1st being the 8th attempted rejoining. It's more like the Ascians just acted opportunistically, rather than in any specific or coherent order. And who knows, maybe the 11th reflection is one FF11 based Vana'diel. No, not actually. To be real a second, not the 11th nor any of the reflections are likely to be Vana'diel. The metaphysics, timeline, geographies, and a host of other things make it so FF11 as a reflection does not really make any sense, at least from a lore perspective. And you may say, but Elioaux, the crossover event! To which I'd say that none of them are typically seen as canon other than the holiday events, and even then it gets a little weird. Though there is the possibility that Aroha is still hanging around in Eorzea, to which you also might say, but Nier makes no sense. To which I would say, correct, but seeing as they literally burned its lore out of Encyclopedia Eorzea Volume 3, I think we're all happy to just not think about it too much. And if you think I'm joking, by the way, go look at your copy of Encyclopedia Eorzea Volume 3, page 160, and to the answer of where the Nier lore fits into, yeah, the answer is they burned it out. I'm not sure. So, yeah. Just a thought. What is very possible, though, is an interpretation of Vana'diel on the source or reflections, in a way like how Ivalice was handled with by not actually being tactics or Final Fantasy XII, but an interpretation. Another possibility is the infinite possibility engine that is the interdimensional rift, but we're not here to speculate about alliance raids, so I'm going to move on. Stepping back a bit, let's talk more about how we ended up with the unique situation of a sundered star. Let's rewind time to 12,000 years ago to the world unsundered. The star exists as a paradise and as one whole planet, with the predominant race upon it being the ancients. Sorry, I skipped over one. To start with, you love them, you hate them, you still wonder what's going on with an unaccounted for of them. It's the Ascians. The other contributing party being the sundering lady herself, Vana. Now let's rewind time 12,000 years ago to the world unsundered. The star exists as a paradise and as one whole planet, with the predominant race upon it being the ancients. The first final days begins an apocalypse that threatens all life on the star, to which half of the ancients give themselves up to create a dark primal that could save them, with the idea that they will sacrifice other life of the star to trade places with those inside of Zodiark. The ancient Vana creates a counterforce primal of light in Hydaelyn and becomes her heart. In full awareness of what she was doing, she used her power as Hydaelyn to sunder Zodiark and the Star of Aetheris into the Source and 13 reflections, creating moons for each of the 14 shards, 13 reflections, and Source, with the shard of Zodiark's Aether being trapped within each moon. The effect of the literal strike by Hydaelyn may still be visible on the land. This is just wild speculation, but we are told that the break in the Stardust Sea was due to the fighting of two ancient deities, and there is a long history of ancient memories of the world unsundered being passed down, like we see in the Katana Ravel with the depictions of Hydaelyn and Zodiark's contest, or in the Star Shower of the Final Days. Speaking of star showers, let's talk about the souls of Aetheris and what happened to them when the star was sundered, and what happens during Rejoinings. When Hydaelyn sundered the star, she also sundered the souls of all those upon it into 14 shards, one for each reflection and the source. The only exception was for the 3 unsundered Ascians, Emet-Selch, Elidibus, and Lahabrea. For everyone else, and for all the new lives and souls that came to be on the reflections after that, they would only have 1/14 the soul density, leaving them far weaker but more readily able to interact with forces like Dynamis. This is why the Ascians wish to rejoin all the reflections to the source, to bring back the fully completed souls of their brethren, as well as Zodiark. In causing the prior 7 calamities, the people of the source who possess a soul have a soul that are 8/14 of the density of the world before the sundering. There are some unique cases of people, like Grahatia, who had 2 different selves of timelines merging, though it's likely was more of a merging of memory and general aether of the soul rather than being anything like a rejoined self, the extra leftover aether returning to the sea rather than leaving him something like a 1 in 1/14 person. It's also important to note that soul density is not a linear analog to power. For instance, Ranjit may have only had 1/14 a sundered soul, but was stronger than the majority of the Scions. Likewise, the Warrior of Light is more powerful than a number of Ancients, even with the ability to use creation magics. Though the Warrior of Light had some help in most of these cases, so if that counts is up to you. The Warrior of Light is also a bit of a hiccup, as we have rejoined with the shard of our soul from the first, Ardbert, bringing us to not being 9/14 rejoined. It's also why our soul was dense enough to then handle the White Warden Ether. Basically, increasing soul density is more like increasing the size of the battery rather than the amount of raw energy stored within, though it can also result in an increase in Aether. Consuming souls for use is separate to the rejoining of souls, however. In the case of the Voidsent or Zeralja in the Everkeep, it's less that a soul is made whole, and more that 2 are merged into 1 by consuming the other with untold consequences, from the fusing of memories and consumption of living Aether to empower the self. Bodies and souls being like batteries in that they can only contain so much Aether. Past certain points, all manner of ill effects take place, like bodily transformation or the breaking down of body and soul. But where do souls actually come from? Souls naturally come to be as an emergent property of an ethereal sea, which itself comes to be as a natural byproduct of the aether collecting in the sea of stars. Effectively, aether collecting out in space, creating a core that is a dense amount of aether that then forms a physical shell around it. and creating a planet with a physical shell and sea of aether at its heart. Souls themselves are made up of living aether, the only real source of it in existence, and by themselves are a blank slate. When combined with memory aether and a physical form, though, you get a person. Souls and memory are technically two distinct things, but are intrinsically linked. It's also nearly impossible to intentionally make souls, with one uniquely terrible mother-based exception in Athena, as they seem to be a complex emergent property of flowing condensed aether. You can coax a condensed aether into a shell powerful enough to contain it, and have a soul arise as an emergent phenomena, like with the anima weapons, but architecting one seems to be well beyond almost all known capability. When it comes to souls, not everyone that exists now was created and sundered when the world was still whole. Plenty came to be after the sundering. Example of those who possess a sundered soul, though, of the ancient world, are those who have awakened to the echo. Something almost any sentient being can inherit, like we saw with the Sahagan priest in the 2.x patches. Though some who do not have the echo can still feel a yearning to an unsundered world they never knew. Each member of the Ascian's convocation fall into this category. People from the reflections bearing the fragmented souls of one of the 13 convocation members. These people, remember, Azem was kicked out of the convocation when Zodiark was around the time Zodiark was created, and therefore the convocation of 14 is the convocation during the time of the Ancients, but the Ascian organization only has 13. These people are instilled with memories from convocation stones, pieces of crystal which can play host to memories or magics, not unlike job stones or soul crystals, to create a sort of Frankenstein monster of the ancient they once were, with one dominant personality rising to the surface. See possible problems in people like Amon, Fandaniel, or Logriff and Gaia. With the stones now being ours, there is no possibility of any new members being awakened. It's worth pointing out that if the stone does not have enough memories, as in the case that was of the stone of Fandaniel, Amon's personality won out because there just wasn't enough of Hermes' memories really within the crystal, or memories of Hermes imparted by the Unsundered into it, and therefore that personality became more dominant. The same way that Logriff and Gaia seem to also almost fight for control within her own body as well. Beyond memories, though, the stones could be implanted with magics, like with Azem's Convocation Stone, which was made in secret by Emmett Selk, because he missed his friend. And within the Stone of Azem, he put a spell created by the original Azem to call allies to the ability to call allies to your side across space, and maybe even time. It's not totally clear, because if it's using the interdimensional rift, it gets wibbly wobbly. But at least we know for sure space. A similar spell that seems to have been embedded in the key, but more on the key in a bit here. But not just echoes of soul were left from the sundering. Physical remnants of the ancients were left, like the ruins of Amarot on the first, which Emmett Selk used as the foundation of his glamour, as well as places like Academia and Amnesis Aniter. How many ruins are left on other reflections, or if there even are any, isn't something we really know, with the 13th being blasted to hell, and the 4th, 8th, 9th, and 11th, 4th, 8th, and 11th still being mysteries. Well, okay, let me rephrase that. 4th, 8th, 9th, and 11th still being mysteries. Kind of. The 9th we know to be the Unlost World, but we know so little outside the bounds of living memory that all we can say comes from this recorded history that we have. Electrope is an interesting case where it seems to be only found on the 9th, or brought with it when Alexandria fused with Yassulani to make Heritage found. But the story of its discovery by a random Lalafell happening upon it is just a little too convenient, and sounds a lot like the initial step of ploys Emmett Selk used in the creation of Garlemald and Alag. Specifically, the way in which Solus introduced Magitech, and some of the other penchant for nation building things he did with Alag. Even the exodus of the Aloalans and their discovery of a random artifact reminds me of Ascian plans, or at least the chaotic nature of the original Azem. Perhaps Electrope itself is remnant of a material from the world unsundered. Y'shtola speculates that the reason there are no ruins of the ancient world on the source is that the calamities, which only affected the source, may have removed them over the millennia. But who knows what we might find in exploring far-flung places like the Blind Frost, or even further beyond. Beyond bits of buildings lying on the ocean floor, what's cool is that the term reflection is possibly a little more literal than you might think. The actual geography of the first and source, for instance, seems to be identical, even if the topography is different. You can perfectly overlay them. Which, between the calamities of the source and 12,000 years of split history, makes sense. You can even literally overlay Eorzea on top of Norvrant and see that it aligns perfectly, even into the bits of Ilsebard you can see. Like how they have geographical mirrors, there are also spatial mirrors between reflections. For example, if someone were to travel from a void gate on Mare Lamentorum, they would end up on the red moon of the 13th. Maybe not in the exact same space, but close enough. And when we are teleported to the first from the Labyrinth of the Ancients in Mordona, it roughly matches where we end up in Lakeland. If the Gate of Remembrance cutting between the Skydeep Cenote and Living Memory, or the dimensional gate created above Heritage Found are co-linked in such a way is not clear, but at least one of them would indicate Alexandria existing in an analogous area of Yak or Jacques Tarral on the ninth reflection. Okay, here's another puzzle. Here's another puzzle for you. And it gets into the nature of how each of the reflection overlap. We know each reflection has its own moon. But if you, say, flew out into the Sea of Stars, went to another planet, and came back, would you land on the source? The first? We don't really know. Based on how Midgard Summer arrived, the assumption is that from the outside looking in, you'd see and arrive on the source. Since while the reflections are a localized bubble dimension of stacked planes, the Sea of Stars they look out onto aren't separate realities. So if I fly into space from the first and go to the Dragon Star, and then come back, do I return to the first? Or the source? The dragons are a really interesting litmus test for everything to do with how the reflections operate, from Midgard Summer arriving sometime after the Sundering, but long before the first calamity. His first brood all having great power, seeming not just from their antiquity, but possibly from possessing unsundered souls of the Dragon Star, unlike their brood, who possess souls of the sundered source. That's why we only have dragons on the source. They are aliens, A, and B, only arrived after the Sundering. But what about the other races? Many of the races we play as or ally with can be seen across reflections, from the Ondo, Mord, and Zune of the first, and the corresponding Sahagin, Kobold, and Amalja of the source. There are many more examples of being that arose from the Sundering across reflections, but there are also some that are unique to each world and its histories, like the Ananta and Ixali, which are so often is the case, also the fault of Allag, and so don't exist on the other reflections as they post-date the Sundering. It's also possible that we could see unique races, let's say, with the ninth reflection. I don't know, perhaps the Burmeshians? Just a thought. This all dovetails nicely into switching focus to Dawntrail, because when it comes to playable races, there are plenty of options to talk about, like Elves of the First, Elezen of the Source, Eldite of the Unlost World, and whatever the heck Barbaricia is. Which, from the 13th. But also, way more importantly, the Lalafell, which come from the Source, the Dwarves, who come from the First, and the Milala, which come from the ninth reflection. Or at least some do, because as we now know, some Milala are actually from the Source. Or at least some of their ancestors are. And also, whether you want to argue if Kryl technically would count as a Milala, as she was born in the ninth reflection, however spent her entire life effectively growing up as a plainsfolk in Eorzea, well, on Hydaelyn. I picked her here because it was a cute picture. Sue me. Okay. But that was part one. Let's go into part two. With everything we've gone over, we now have a framework to talk about some of Dawntrail's many revelations and expand our current the expansion of our current knowledge. First, then, let's talk about methods of travel between reflections, of which the most important thing that Dawntrail has done is open new horizons via the mysterious piece of crystal infused with magic and contained in the Electro Goblet that we know as the key. Up to this point, there have only been 3 ways to travel to other reflections. The magic of the 8th Umbral Crystal Tower, that used an ungodly amount of aether to tear a Warrior of Light shaped hole in the fabric of reality. The Void Gates, that through raw astrality tear holes between 13th and the Source, or other reflections, like with the Hollows of the First. These 2 were explored pretty deeply in 5.0 through 6.x, and prior to that in things like the Crystal Tower. And Y'shtola and all of this also because Y'shtola is desperate to get back to a certain Hrothgar boyfriend. And honestly, the 13th may have been a convenient hub for cross-reflection travel. For a long time, I speculated that the 13th would be a really good terminal, basically, to access all the other reflections. It seems like they're making a far more convenient way with the creation of the key, though. The last and most important way to travel between the interdimensional rift are the magics of Azem, the power to summon the stars to your side. Drawing people together across space to your side, and conveniently, the symbol of office of Azem appeared from the key during the battle in Interphos. The key, before being augmented by Electrope, even shared the wishing or prayer mechanic necessary to use the magics. The Lalafell of the South Seas had the crystal within the goblet, and after praying to it with all of their might, it created a gate to salvation that they fled through, leading them to the 9th reflection. Combining that crystal with Electrope in order to use it more readily, the group Preservation hoped that they'd have a more powerful method to cross the bounds of the interdimensional rift. How readily we can access that power, now that we own it, and to what degree, still a little ambiguous. But we have been talking all this time and haven't even hit on the medium by which we travel into reflection, the interdimensional rift. The interdimensional rift is a space between worlds. It is a chaotic no man's land between reflections and existence, outside of time and outside of space. Here, one can travel to any place or any moment, though even entering the rift is hard enough, let alone directing where you go. We have seen it at various points in our adventures, the first being a little earlier than you might think when we enter the Chrysalis, the Ascians' hideout in the rift, in order to save Minfilia from Nabrialis. Elidibus also attempts to trap us there as a final-ditch effort in 5.3, but the magics of Azem free us. The second time is when we travel to Omega's domain, where Omega had used its own technological might to enter the rift, creating a localized bubble to house its tournament, and using it to learn the stories of other reflections in order to craft some of its combatants. The first time we truly travel the rift for reflection reasons is when the Crystal Exarch pulled us through it with his magics to bring us to the first. We also go through it when entering the 13th, or traveling from the Unlost World to the Strayborough Deadwalk. The last type of usage is when Elidibus used the power of the Crystal Tower to send us through time instead of space, back onto Elpis. So far, we have seen it as a spatial and temporal link between points, but its limits aren't known. Is it a corridor so limitless that it can connect all worlds and times, or merely those canonical to Final Fantasy XIV? Whether that means everything that has or will happen is contained within, or literally any possibility, completely debatable. And a lecture on the mechanics of how time travel works in 14, as I keep alluding to, is its own panel, frankly. What is important, though, is that through this rift is drawn passengers, like ourselves, but also the aether that transfers during a rejoining via dimensional compression, like what happens during the 7th Umbral Calamity. In Dawntrail, we actually see a localized version of compression, where instead of an entire star, only a large chunk of one is brought from the Unlost World to the source, like what we see with Heritage Found. When Sphene used the key to interdimensionally fuse Alexandria and the Everkeep with the source, those places combined with Yassulani, creating the region we know as Heritage Found. Effectively, the region you took Alexandria, you take Yassulani, have a localized rejoining, boom, that's how you get Heritage Found. And that's why Heritage Found still has some things that were from Yassulani and some things that could have only come from Alexandria. Case in point, a large deposit of Electrope. Dawntrail also shows us links between reflections can be more refined than simple tears, or even the bigger void gates. with the Gate of Remembrance that bridges living memory and the Skydeep cenote. Since we're talking about living memory, let's talk some about the Unlost World. My original version of this panel had a section on speculating which reflection the Unlost World was, but thankfully, Yoshi P made things easy for us by flat out telling us it's the ninth. This was in a recent interview, and frankly, it makes my job a lot easier. It's also why I didn't explain more at the top that it was the ninth. One point still going over, though, is how we know that despite the rising 11 energies that affected it, we know that the Unlost World is not the 12th that was rejoined during the second calamity, since the star continues to exist. The easiest way to prove this is that the Milala did not even arrive on the Unlost World until multiple calamities after the second umbral calamity, the Calamity of Lightning. Therefore, they only ended up leaving to go to the Unlost World during the fifth umbral calamity, which means it's impossible for the ninth to have been the one suffering the 11th calamity. On top of it, the fact that it's not rejoined. The Scions state in the cenote that there is no easy way to know which reflection is which from a surface level, with the Ascians gone. But the ninth fits and also links well, since Dawntrail is very Final Fantasy IX themed, just with Alexandria alone, but even Viper is very much based off of Zidane and any number of things. For all of you FF9 heads, you know. The music, all sorts of stuff. To a point that then Gaia and Terra, two planets fused together by dimensional compression in Final Fantasy IX, might be relevant concepts going into 7.x, or in some way already what they've been hearkening to with the events around Alexandria and the Source. But to be fair, there's no reason to think there must be a direct connection between reflection number and corresponding Final Fantasy title. If that was true, all the Final Fantasy IV references we saw in the 13th would have been saved for the fourth reflection, as an example. There are times when it does cross over, however. For instance, Dalamud being somewhat like Meteor from Final Fantasy VII, and it being the 7th umbral calamity and rejoining the 7th reflection. Okay, time for a bit of a mini timeline, because I think this might be helpful for framing out people's reference point for how things take place in the Unlost World to our current day. If we're going to talk about the Elioaux in Alexandria, we should go over a brief timeline of events on the Unlost World between then and now. On the Source in the past, a group of Elioaux trying to escape the icy destruction of the 5th umbral calamity pray fervently upon a sacred relic that opens an interdimensional gate to the 9th reflection. Traveling through, they join the existing Milala population therein. This, from the perspective of the Source, would have been probably somewhere like 3,000 years ago, 3,000, 4,000-ish years ago. Sometime later, 1,000 years before living memory, lightning begins to grow steadily stronger and more rampant on the 9th reflection. One day, a Milala wandering in the woods finds an ore that could take lightning and convert it to other aspected energies. This is Electrope. By impregnating it with magical circuits, it could create all kinds of effects. Not long after, wars begin for this new limited resource. And if you haven't noticed by now, effectively, Electrope, well, other than the re-aspecting of elements bit, although there's something, Electrope is effectively a semiconductor. Basically they etch, they etch like board circuits into it, and then arcane board circuits into that allow them to do all sorts of magical effects. But that plays into and kind of supports why Solution 9 is not only like hyper advanced, but also has the like futurism aesthetic. Though Final Fantasy has always had a very interesting relationship with both future and past, or I should say science fiction and fantasy. Even if you just look at any one of them, every Final Fantasy can basically be put on a scale of science fiction to fantasy, and what they sometimes lean more one way or the other, but they're always somewhere on that spectrum. Oops. A final war known as the Storm Surge takes place, and the nation of Lindblum uses a superweapon that causes mass destruction, devastating the continent with lightning aether. During the Storm Surge, Everkeep is built. At the same time, a shadowy Alexandrian group known as Preservation begins their project to store memory in machines, creating the first Endless. With the land devastated by lightning aether and inhospitable, the Levin dome around Alexandria goes up to protect it, sealing it off from the outside world. Alexandria proceeds to operate much as we know it now, and at some point, living memory is built, with the population of Endless steadily growing unsustainable, with the birth of souls needed to sustain them being outpaced by the demand. Alexandria proceeds. A plan to use the Milala artifact to open new pathways to other reflections is hatched by preservation, but as they begin to tap into the artifact's power after augmenting it with Electrope, two Milala escape with it and their newborn child, using a recently constructed prototype gate from living memory to the source to leave the key and their child in safe hands. After 20 years on the source and an unknown amount of time in the Unlost world, the situation in living memory is becoming dire, and sustaining the Endless is becoming impossible. At this desperate time, the prototype gate in living memory connecting it to the source opens, and Zoraal makes a pact with Sphene to protect Alexandria from him, and to allow her to acquire more souls to keep living memory functioning. They use the key that Zoraal has brought with him as the foundation for their plans. Meanwhile, on the source, our history is happening, though we don't know when to match events because time dilation. The point of intersection is when an enormous dimensional gate and dome appears over northern Jacques Tarral. Through the gate, and beneath the dome of Alexandria, Alexandria and Yassulani have fused via dimensional compression, effectively a localized rejoining to become heritage found. This region is still operating on Unlost time, so 30 years passes there while only days pass on the source. When the Vanguard installation breaches the dome, time within the region sinks to the source. Still with me? Good. Okay, so can I just take a single moment, to laugh a little hysterically? Don't worry, I won't actually laugh into the mic. I can't believe I'm saying this, but not only are Milala from the source, which, okay, but Elioaux lore ended up being key information for the fundamental plot of Dawntrail and possibly the next arc of Final Fantasy XIV, and I just can't not find that really funny. What's next? A Cactuar-themed dungeon will be fundamental to cross-reflection understand it. Oh. Anyways, one thing the game has always done well is to explain to you everything you need to understand if you aren't paying too close attention, but really reward you for knowing more about the world and its history without making it mandatory. And I love it for that. This is also why you should always do side content in Final Fantasy XIV. I cannot beseech you enough. If it has a blue marker, do it. Actually, to be frank, if you ask me if it has a yellow marker, do it, but I know that's a losing battle. One thing that seems to get people a little confused, and is even pointed out by Dawntrail, is that if Kryl is from the Unlost world, shouldn't her soul be thinner than those of the Source? There are actually a few pretty easy answers to this. If Kryl's soul was one of the original ones brought to the Unlost world by Lalafell of the Source, her soul should already have been 6/14 rejoined. Plus, if it merged with its counterpart in the Unlost world in the Ethereal Sea of the Unlost world, it would be 7/14. She was also on the Source for the 7th Umbral Calamity, which would make her 8/14 like everyone else. Another possibility is that she had a soul purely of the Unlost world, but when Hydaelyn transported her away from Val when it was lost in the lifestream before it became the Isle Eureka, her soul may have rejoined to its source counterpart in the Ethereal Sea. I think that latter one's less likely. I think the former one is the case, but just putting it out there. The 9th reflection on Lost World may have suffered its own pseudo-calamity across the continent that Alexandria sat on, and presumably the reflection as a whole. With vast Levin swells already taking place for hundreds of years and only worsening after the firing of the Lindblom superweapon, and the Everkeep dome going up, it's quite possible that the rising energies had to either worsen or gone somewhere. We know the reflection wasn't rejoined, but what actually is left of the Unlost world besides living memory? Since most of the history outside of the bubble is unknown to the people of Alexandria, we can't say, as it's only newly been removed. If people still inhabit the world, they might be susceptible to the same leaven sickness as some of the people in Heritage found, something that may affect the soul or the body or both. With how much is patterned off of Final Fantasy IX, it's worth looking at something like the world of Gaia from that game to guess what people or places we might have seen. We might see once we actually go and explore the rest of the ninth reflection. The Aoife tree even gets name dropped and even has a representation in living memory. Also, the term dimensional compression, as far as I'm aware, first is used in Final Fantasy and specifically in Final Fantasy IX. So even that usage is new to 14 as far as I'm aware. Unless I think Encyclopedia Eorzea Volume 1 may have a reference to dimensional compression. I promise if I can't find it in 30 seconds, I will pass on. There's one place. Yeah, Encyclopedia Eorzea 1 is the only place that I can think of where it's used in 14, specifically until 7.0. It's possible that in the intervening decades or centuries since the dome went up around Alexandria, the ninth may have healed itself, as there's a full day and night cycle, and the moon even still rests in the sky. If the Aether of Zodiark broke apart when he was slain on the Source and returned to the ethereal sea of the Unlost World, like the version did on the Source, it could have quickened the healing, as that's part of the specific design of Zodiark's astral disposition. Zodiark's Aether didn't rejoin the ethereal sea of the 13th because the ethereal sea at the heart of the void had been rent apart by the astrality of the flood of darkness, leaving nothing to heal. Effectively, imagine the ethereal sea like water. If you make it too astral, it becomes steam and blows apart and goes everywhere. If you make it too umbral, it turns to ice and freezes and can't flow. Both situations are bad. Too much of either of those is a bad thing. The ninth beginning to heal or having already healed could get explored in the patch content or in future expansions, along with the now realigned and slowly healing 13th and 1st. But, since we mentioned Zodiark, we need to talk about something Dawntrail so far has had a distinct lack of. It's the Ascians. So why do we gotta talk about this? Didn't we put an end to this already with Shadowbringers and Endwalker? Well, like I've insinuated before, the events surrounding the Storm Surge in Alexandria are awfully reminiscent of an Ascian ploy. And hell, if it was their planned rejoining after the 8th Umbral Calamity, that would have made it the 9th Umbral Calamity, like at Final Fantasy IX, on the 9th Reflection. And if any Ascians responsible died before its completion, then the necessary events on the Source wouldn't have been prepared in order to actually cause a rejoining. Like how the 13th Flood of Darkness failed. Weirdly, on the top of all of that, Yoshi-P made specific comments about it helping to know the names of the convocation before Dawntrail came out, even though they have not popped up in any way, shape, or form. Other than, I guess you could argue, Azem? With the there are 4 missing Ascians currently. Pastrat, Halmarat, Altima, and Judelafon. They're all suffering unknown fates, be it inside raid content, like with Mechon and Logif, or MSQ, like with the 3 Unsundered. I think we'll get closure to some, if not all, of their stories by the end of 7.x. Their purpose in the world went with Zodiark, so what we encounter will either be the scars of what they left behind, or what remains of them, finding some kind of path forward in the world. One good place could be the mysterious president of the Arcadian. Another much stronger possibility is the surrounding events of the upcoming Alliance raid, the type of tragedy that created a version of the Shadow Lord being the kind of heartbreak they'd be involved in. Or perhaps Preservation had more involvement with them than them, or any of the 4 may have taken actions on the remaining 4th, 8th, or 11th reflections. That said, just like how Sphene attempted to conquer the Source and other reflections, there's no guarantee any of the other reflections won't have similar goals. One reflection may even have suffered its own grim fate if the apparition of another world we see in Interphos is anything to go by. Sadly, I do not have a photo of it, as it was very hard to try and take a photo of the background during the fight. But if you know the part in Interphos where you're doing the hole in the wall, if you look around you, Sphene specifically claims that the gate is showing you that the key is showing another world, and it's basically like a Earth severely like destroyed floating rocks. It kind of looks like the inside of Ozma with the Nimian ruins, but it's definitely not Nimian. It's definitely something completely different. But it's not clear what that is exactly supposed to be. I will be curious though if during 7.1 when we get a EX3, like the EX version of Interphos, if there will be more places we might see. Okay. Yes. Okay. So, looking forward to the future. As we're headed into a new Area 14, a new dawn, if you will, a whole arc lays before us. In Dawntrail alone, we are left with plenty of questions. Why was Electrup only found on the Unlost World? What will it mean for Tyrell and the Source to have access to it now? What other kinds of nefarious things did Preservation get up to? What are the implications of the regulators ethically and etherically? What remains of the Ninth Reflection outside of living memory? And who is Gulul Ja's mother? Because no one can convince me that Zeral Ja recreationally procreates. In Tyrell, we still have places to explore, like Lozeniheta, Tiak Tiak, and Shade's Triangle. We also have a giant gaping hole in the ocean with the Fathomless Sea. We haven't spent almost any time at all with Kentum Ram, who, despite pushing 100, looks exceptional. Roganen don't crack. And that's all just in Tyrell. Don't forget, we also have all the variant dungeon possibilities there, as well as back in Eorzea and elsewhere. We have cosmic exploration, and a GPU full of raids to do, beasts to master, and Vana'diel to discover. Most important is the key. The crystal within, housing magics of Azem and augmented by Electrope, apparently has powers well beyond what Preservation could discover. A veritable heart of Sabik 2.0, if you will. How exactly did a crystal with Azem's magic find its way to an island full of Lalafells on the Source? Will it be used as a way to bridge reflections, creating mass connections and collaboration? A tool to invade other worlds, or forcing all of the shards back into one unsundered whole, wiping away all life upon each reflection? A tool for good or evil, depending on who wields it, and a story ahead of us that relies on that understanding of what it does and how best to put it to use. What about the far future ahead of us? We have 5.5 story patches before 8.0, but the next expansion is coming. We have a whole dragon-riddled continents to explore in Mericidia, 3 whole unseen reflections, and a sea of stars filled with life of it all its own. A war is going on in Hingashi, the Blind Frost is still a mystery, and Ilsabard is still covered in clouds! We have new friends to meet and old ones far afield trying to make a better world. What could Garlemald learn from Alexandria or Tyrell? How will Tuliolal handle its new connections to Thavnair? And with their new partnership and the key as a tool, could the 13th and 1st become more active players on the Source? There's a wide world of possibilities, and we still face plenty of threats known and unknown, but understanding what we have and will face may help us forge a new trail to a better tomorrow. Okay, that's gonna do it for me. Thank you all for listening, and if we still have time, I will be sticking around for answers and questions. It looks like we do still have a solid 30 minutes. I have been Elioaux Forgerau, and you can find me and my work on the Eorzea Archives YouTube channel, as well as occasionally streaming there or on T Live. If you're interested in joining our community, you can join our discord.gg/Eorzea Archives, and you can also, if you're interested in joining our FC, we have one on Crystal Curl that you are more than welcome to join. On the Discord, I hold events like weekly lore book clubs, Mount Farming, and map nights. And a big thanks to Vinthina, Ray, and the T Book Club for all your feedback. With that said, anyone got some questions? I'm going to open up the stream chat, and I will also open up the game, so I will be able to see all y'all's questions, and I will probably just be kind of answering them as we go. Let me change my display capture from all to the game, so at least we have that's a little better. Y'all can see y'all. Okay. If people have questions, let's see, what's the easiest way to do that? You know what? I think I'm going to do it this way because it'll probably be easier for me. If you have questions and you're in-game, just go ahead and whisper me them. And in the short term, I think I will go work off of the chat. Okay. Could the 11th sickness be an analog to sin or corruption, as an overwhelming aspect of ambient aether is actively preventing the patient to get better? So it's interesting because, yes, it could be an interesting analog. The fact that there's that ambient lightning energy seems to be a fundamental requirement. However, what's fascinating to me is that if it was purely an issue of soul corruption, theoretically the regulator system should work to cure it, or at the very least help deal with it. Though the fact that the regulator system doesn't actually help with the soul issues out of things like Arcadian does make me think that there is definitely something about that. One thing that is interesting is we don't have any history, at least so far recorded, about bodily transformation beyond that paralysis. Now, that may just be because the Levin energy and heritage found is not quite as bad as something like, let's say, the sheer amount of raw umbrality present all over the first. Or the fact that you had that part of what was making people struggle in the first was not just that raw umbrality, but on top of it, slight wounds from Sin Eaters allowing light to get in. So there's quite a few possibilities there, and there's also a possibility that if it's about the energies getting into the body as well, like it would be on the first, that the constant use of lightning energies in Solution 9 and elsewhere may also be poisoning people to some extent. Okay. Is it possible that the 13th and the 1st can work together to rebalance in a world since Zeros was able to make some light transfer to the 13th? Yeah, absolutely. So honestly, it was something that a lot of us, I think, had been speculating on for a long time. The main problem was there was no mechanism to be able to transfer that large amount of light or darkness from one location to the other. Obviously, they solved that in the patch content with the Void Gate system and the Aether Relay system. There's really nothing to stop it now. The one only thing that I hesitated to worry about is you couldn't, for instance, if you just dumped all of the a bunch of 13th Aether into the first, it would cause problems. Like, you can't just like dump a bunch of darkness and dump a bunch of light and not cause things to go out of balance. But if you're constantly transferring between them and allowing things to adjust, and there's no reason it shouldn't work. And I think everything about 6.x patches support that. So I would definitely look to that as the future, both, and also the fact that the Moria maybe actually be able to be even more helpful as they are constantly leaking darkness. Let me open up you guys. Let me open that further so I can see you. Which unexplored shard are you the most curious about? The problem is currently we can't really say anything about the 4th, 8th, or 11th. So the thing is any speculation on them is rooted in almost nothing other than maybe possibly some of the history information that we get from Omega, from the stories that he learned from other reflections, but we don't know which one they were. So I can't say that there is one, but if we look at first, if we look to the ones that I guess we do know some about with 1st, 13th, and 9th, I would say that probably 9th is maybe the most interesting at point, because 13th landmass is a lot of it's lost. The first, most of it is still the empty, or the empty. However, with it recovering over time, I am excited to see maybe is there a future where we get to actually go explore out into the parts of the empty that have been restored, a la some of the stuff that's happened in Eden. Would Emmett or Elidibus have stepped in the regards to Sphene had she attempted what she did in the events of 7.0, since her Aether vampires would have interfered with their plans for joining? Presumably. The problem with their plan is that effectively using up all the living Aether and constantly just sucking out of the planet, you're, unlike killing people, and which is basically putting souls and Aether eventually back into that system, you're expending Aether to perpetually keep that system going. One thing that would be curious is to see if any of the Ascians saw what living memory was, and if they could take that and use it in some way to achieve some of the ends that they wanted to. But presumably they would have attempted to stop Sphene's machinations. I was wondering in the chat, could it be possible that Kryl didn't yet have a soul when she was brought over to the source? Even as we saw it go into an infant, she instead received a soul while in the source and explains density. That's an interesting theory. I don't know of any examples. Typically, when we're shown that when new life's born, it receives a soul pretty much immediately upon either birth or existence, basically any form of cognition. But I think there's plenty of reasons to take that as a hypothesis and say that there's a chance that, yeah, you only gain a soul, maybe at the same time you start to gain actually a real form of cognition. So just positing that, yeah, maybe you only actually really have a soul once you're 2 or something, the same time when you actually start to form memories. I don't know that I would presume that to be the case. I would definitely say that I think there's some evidence to say that, not immediately throw that out. Based on what we know from the lore and potential real-world inspirations, what do you think you see Maricidia? What do you personally want to see? I mean, look, Final Fantasy XIV Australia, right? I mean, most of the evidence that we have about the bits of Mericidian lore, its depictions from EE1 and some of the stabs, like the Kupli, I forget what it's called, but the Realm-Reborn staff. Definitely, the main inspirations I tend to see are more Australian, but I think they could definitely take a lot of African inspirations too, because really the only place that is semi-Africa coded, and really it's maybe North Africa coded, really, is like Thanolin. Beyond that, there's not really a representation for that place, and I really think there should be. What do I want? I would love to go just see Mericidia and to see the different peoples I would love to see the different peoples that are depicted in the Warring Trad, and on top of that, I would really love to see I would desperately love to see but some sort of ruins that show us more about the dragon Bahamut was. I would desperately love to see more about the real Bahamut, not the primal. Based on what we know from lore and potential real world. Oh yeah, okay. What can be the most reasonable explanation for Arcadian soul shifters being able to revert back to their human form despite all their kinds of soul-based mutations being permanent? That's hard. Oh, and of course it's infinite. Of course you're the one asking. One speculation is technological manipulation, so specifically because the regulators are enabling it as opposed to just purely taking it into oneself. The other possibility is that the regulators can undo the transformation, but they cause permanent damage. That could go along with why all the Arcadian fighters seem to be suffering from a sort of soul sickness as a byproduct of the transformations. I would need to replay the Arcadian 2 to see if there's more comments about it. Because I may be wrong. There may be more to describe it in specific, but I would go with that. Do you think we will see another reflection of a Zem Warrior of Light as we go exploring the non-destructive reflections? I think almost certainly. I think there's an interesting question to be asked about whether or not the original Golbez, not Durante, but actual Golbez, the one trapped in the Memoria, may or may not be one of our reflection, one of ourselves, just from their role, how they brought people together, what they did, you mean it's not so dissimilar to not only what we do, but people like Tenzin, which is kind of soft alluded to be an earlier incarnation of the Source's Warrior of Light, or Azem Bearer. And we see specifically into their memories when we hold it up, their Memoria. I've got another question. Could it be possible for an Assi to be behind either Preservation or Lindblum's construction of the level above? I wouldn't just say possible. I would say likely. I'm basing that loosely just off of the type of plan and type of event that it was, mixed with the fact that what would be very interesting and make a lot of sense is if one of the Unsundered in specific or one of the Sundered set that up as an intentional plan, but then was not around to pay it off, you know? So I would say definitely not like, oh, for sure, but I would say it's fairly likely, especially if they want to wrap up. I think we're not going to necessarily deal with a bunch of Ascian bullshit. Oh, sorry, pardon my language. But we will. I think there's a good chance we'll deal with the fallout of some of their endeavors, because just because we stopped them doesn't mean the legacy of the past goes away. Do you think we'll explore the rest of the ninth chart? I don't know. I really don't know what to say with that one, because it's like I could imagine an expansion where we go back to the first. Like, it'd be cool if there was an expansion where we went to like the first 13th and 9th and explored them more. What I would expect is that during 7.x, we may explore the 9th reflection in the same way that we explored the 13th, where there may be some instance zones, but I wouldn't expect any maps, and I wouldn't expect getting a map there like in the next expansion or so. But, you know, never say never. Let's look back at chat, see what you got. Nice to know that I'm the one who sees Afro inspiration in Mericidia. I'm personally hoping for 14 version of Wakanda based on Allegan tech. I mean, there would be, I think there's something to be said about Corvos. The Corvosi may tie some into that. To be fair, the Corvosi are more Persian with like the rug and some of the other stuff, but you know, you definitely could see some of that there. Baja-like zone, maybe? Yeah, well, to be fair, the exploration zone that we're getting in 7.x is going to be the crescent, is going to be the, well, it's going to be Shade's Triangle, and the first one's going to be a cult crescent. But, I mean, maybe somehow there is a portal to the 9th or something like that. Yeah, no, I wouldn't toss it away. But it could be a good exploration zone sometime in the future. You discussed earlier about exploring space in other shards. This is something that has had me question if each shard has their own space with different or familiar planets. The source of each shard is just a bubble planet and a moon. Yeah, so it's a bubble planet and a moon. The sea of stars that exists outside each reflection is all the same. The rest of the world was not sundered or in any way changed. For instance, you could still see the dragon star from the first. The thing is that we know that from a combination of some of the information in EE1, Shadowbringers, Endwalker, and then in Endwalker, and then in Encyclopedia Eorzea Volume 3, someone specifically outright basically says it in the early, one of the early chapters. Though it's always worth pointing out that Encyclopedia Eorzeas are in-universe texts, and so therefore are not always to be trusted as the end-all be-all for facts. But yeah, so basically, all the reflections in the source exist in the same physical space, for lack of a better way of but then they're dimensionally shifted from each other. We haven't been to Corvos either, though. It's basically Labyrinthos. Yeah, at least the weather there is similar. Culturally, it'd be very different, but yeah. Came slowly due to AR live rope, but I'm excited that you did this panel. Yeah. Following is more appreciated than question. I spent a fair deal of time staring at the sky, Astromane, and was delighted to find that the constellations align between the shards, but did not exist in the world unsundered. A lot of what you covered supported my conclusions, and I'm hyped to see more analysis from you. Awesome, yeah, and I will be back on videos in October. I'll be streaming and doing videos again in October. There should be a short out by the end of September in like a day or two. But yeah, I'm returning to content, and I'm very excited to do things like streams where we read Encyclopedia Eorzea Volume 1 through 3. I'm reminded of the moon in Elpis that only appears in the umbral wind weather. Yes, to be fair, the moon in Elpis was an error, and they did remove it, or at least make it, but it's still now there's some ways that you can glitch through and see it. But specifically, there should be no moon in the world unsundered, as the moons are a creation of Hydaelyn, specifically, as basically prisons for Zodiark. Got one more question. Do we know what might have caused the random increase in 11 of the 9th, as it didn't occur before the 11 bomb? We don't. And that's the thing, it was hundreds of years before that. The 11 energy rising is part of what drove the storm surge to happen in the first place. So one thing that's possible could be a byproduct of, again, Ascian machination. Another possibility is that if they do anything like the relationship between Terra Gaia and Final Fantasy IX, that there may be something going on in the ethereal sea of the 9th at its heart that is messing up things. So that's definitely one possibility. Oh, it was removed? Originally it was filed as not a bug. I know that during 6.0, they either removed it or did a lot to hide it. Specifically because they didn't think it was supposed to be in the skybox. At least that's what they talked about. Cool. According to Encyclopedia Eorzea Volume 3, we could have already met Void Sent Warrior of Light as your Reaper avatar, though it's purely conjecture in the book itself. Yep, and that's a hypothesis that I've definitely had a long time ago. I'm a little less big on it now, but I would say that's one of those examples of something where it's very possible that it is just that simple. But we won't know for sure until they basically decide to write it which way, because they like laying seeds. So for instance, it could be Golbez, it could be the avatar, and they could go with whatever they want to depending on the story they want to write. 14 in general, and they've talked about this at length, loves sowing seeds and then paying them off later, but sowing them in a way where it feels like they set them up but also have room to kind of push it one way or another. Good example being setting up Eureka beneath the Crystal Tower and then creating Eureka Orthos instead of originally what they were going to go for. The moon that ended up showing in Elpis, despite the moon being a creation of Hydaelyn. Yeah. I wonder, was the whole moon a joint project between Venat and the pre-Ascian Menfina, or she made just the brands? I feel like there's someone who makes, I don't know if it's in E3 or somewhere, but I'm pretty sure there is a comment from someone that the Hydaelyn's convocation, the person that was Menfina, did help with that. But I can't remember. So there's no moon in the original. Yep. There is no, the moon did not come about until Hydaelyn created it after the Sundering. And there's a moon for each reflection. The moon is not shared by all the reflections. Each reflection has its own moon, and that is the prison for Zodiark. So, and when Zodiark was killed on the source, the Aether that was in the moon, that was the Zodiark shard there, returned to the ethereal seas of their respective reflection, because the moons and the planet have a basically an ethereal ley line between them. Aether can go between the two. One of the reasons we know that's the case is because you can teleport by Aetherite to a moon. Yeah. Does that mean that the Unsundered world doesn't have any tides? Look, when was the last time you saw an ocean in the Unsundered world? I'm just saying, look at Elpis, look at Pandemonium. I ain't seen no seas. Do you think the key was made by Azam expecting us to find it to save the reflections, or is our finding it a lucky coincidence? I don't know, man. It's almost like Tolkienian. It's a chance meeting, right? I think it's impossible to know whether Azam is just messing with people or is doing things like to be helpful, and often it's both at the same time. It's worth pointing out that the key itself wasn't created by Azam. The crystal has magics of Azam in him. We know other people can impart magics of Azim into the crystals, as the same way that our Convocation Stone was imparted into the magics of Azim by Emmett Selk, right? So we don't know who created it or why. There's a lot of possibilities of where it would have been created. The thing is we're pointing out that is, if it was created not by Azim but by like one of the Asians, why wouldn't they keep that tool with them? It's so useful, it's so powerful. So presumably it maybe have been a relic. It's only when Preservation gets their hands on it and equips it with Electrope that we see it in its current form. I think the final days started across the sea from Amarok. Oh, hey, good call. Yeah. That's true. They say across the sea. Good call. Actually makes me think, can the moon soil be the light dust similar to the one in the empty? The moon does not necessarily have a dearth of aether. So, I mean, it does have a lack of some aether, but we know it has a decent amount, enough to be able to like house things. So I would think that the regolith might not be like the burn or the empty. But I mean, maybe it is lacking enough aether so that it is semi-inhospitable. Maybe the regolith is like that. Yeah, it's possible. I have to look into any of the things said by the Loporrits or any of the information of like the fish, because so much lore comes from fish. Oh my god! If you ever want to learn lore in 14, just go read fish. What is considered alive in the void? So hard question. Yeah, Unsundered Pangea. Isn't Golbez still alive in the memory shard, or is that closer to the people of living memory? The name used just and the endless. Golbez is existent within the Moria. What that means is semi-ambiguous, especially because we don't have examples of Memoria being really something that people get freed from. Its description says once you're trapped in that, you're trapped. But look, once you were not sundered, once you were tempered, right? Until we figured out a way around it. So I wouldn't count it out yet. You can't make me start fishing. Hey, you can't just buy all the items. Oh, also, actually, I totally forgot to add my thing for T-Tools. One other thing you can do is, we have something called T-Tools, which is a lovely little thing V, a resident programmer, made. I should have definitely asked them to post the link. You can literally type in any word in the game, and it will pull it up. So, like, just fishing, and you can select which expansion you want. You can select which quest, cutscene, dialogue, fates, items. You can do anything. Obviously, Garland Tools works incredibly well and is similar. However, you can't search for like a specific word. So if you're a lore enthusiast or lore nut, it is ttools.vercel.app/search. And feel free to use it. It is meant as a tool for the community. Yeah, here I'll send. Okay, yeah, I'll send the link in chat. Let's T-tool, and I'll tell you what, this makes it so much easier to. Elioaux. What? I'm logged in. Why are you saying I'm not logged in? It looks like I'm not logged in right now. Okay, I don't have an easy way to send it. Sadly. Oh crap! And that also Goddamn analogs. Yeah, exactly. It's the Alligans. It's definitely the Alligans' fault. In the final dungeon of Endwalker, the Dead Ends, when we were shown different worlds, one specifically reminded me of the Terminator. Are those other planets or other shards that we have seen? There were other planets in the Sea of Stars that died, and their aether was drawled into Ultima Thule. They're talked about quite a bit in, for instance, the Omicron Allied Society quest. They're talked quite a bit in just some of the quests and side quests around Ultima Thule. But you can also read in detail about them in Encyclopedia Eorzea Volume 3. That is definitely the place where you can find out the most about them. Oh yeah, say chat here. Let me. There we go. Post the link in say chat for T-Tools. Also, if you have a question I did not get to it, you may want to put it in chat again because it currently reset my chat when I refreshed. I was trying to figure out if it was combined with the 13th reflection with my question on Golbez, and then I remember that the 13th is stagnant and can't rejoin anyways. Yes, at least in current existence, and now there's no reason that it would want to. If it was restored, ostensibly there's no reason that if the 1st and 13th were restored, why you couldn't try to rejoin them again. But why would you want to? There's no one around who would want to, other than technically maybe one of the remaining 4 Asians, but even for them, there would be no point, as they would not be able to bring back Zodiark, because Zodiark's gone. The ancients that made him up, their aether has returned to the ethereal sea. Most of them have started to break down, so yeah. I need Encyclopedia. Yes, so Encyclopedia Eorzea Volume 1 primarily talks about A Realm Reborn and Heavensward. You have Volume 2, talks about Stormblood primarily, up to like around 4.3. And then you have Volume 3, which talks about Shadowbringers and Endwalker. And hopefully we'll get a 4 before too long. How involved would auricite be in everything that's been discussed here? So, it depends on how you want to define it. So, historically, sorry, I'm just making sure we're not running out of time. Still got 10 minutes. Auricite specifically refers to only a specific number of things, like white auricite, the Duma, and everything in Ivalice. It's also used as a term to refer to Memoria. However, later on in Nuclei specifically says that I just used the term auricite to explain to you what Memoria were because I was worried you wouldn't understand. So, yeah. E4 soon, hopefully. So, auricite being involved with almost, like, there's no reason that it should be involved. I mean, technically speaking, the crystal could be a form of auricite that is used to contain the magics. However, specifically the examples of Zem's magic being contained in the convocation stones, they are crystals, not auricite. And there's no reason that it would have to be a particular advantage to doing so. So I don't think auricite's necessarily involved in anything we're talking about in Dawntrail. However, events around Ultima, not Altima, but Ultima. There's the Asian Ultima and the entity Ultima, different things. The Ultima definitely caused issues in the past. So she's not disconnected from events that we've talked about here, but in terms of 7.0, I would not look to any of the historical or pieces of auricite or any examples that we know of and think that it has any correlation to anything that we're specifically talking about around Dawntrail. I'm going to date myself, but they're still smaller than what encyclopedias were way back when. I'm old enough to remember encyclopedias too, but yeah. The Japanese for auricite is Holy Stone. Yes. But I think that's also tied to, if I'm not mistaken, the Japanese for auricite in tactics or something else also refers to, is like, has a connotation of either uses holy or I mean, obviously if it uses nishi, it's wouldn't, yeah, of course, nishi's not a weird, but I think that part of the reason they named it auricite was because they were trying to harken on to tactics, and that's, I don't remember exactly. I remember looking into this a while ago. Auricite is just there to confuse us. Yeah, it's literally no one ever actually really sits down just to explain it. Japanese. Any potential lore we can get for Future Richlands Ultimate, even if it's if it's a story, what if story? I would assume it's a what if story. I would look to. I mean, look, the possibility is that if we look at DSR and we look at Top, they definitely want to do some kind of what if, at least with the past two. Uwu has a little bit less if, what if UCOB, a little bit less T, but the past two very much have that element to them. Top a little less so, but than DSR. But I would definitely look to that. I think the what if very much could be what if, Logriff becomes dominant, or also what happens if Reen actually becomes an embodiment of Hydaelyn, like she did, or light aether, or and then you have oracles of light and dark fighting against you. Thank you, Skitty. What does Asm's spell in the stone do? It's pulling people across reflection dimensions, or is it just pulling the warrior of light Eorzean's friends? So it is the ability to pull the stars to your side. What that generally means is basically gives the person with enough fervent prayer and wish the ability to pull allies, which is an ambiguous term, across space to be able to aid you. We don't know its limitations. My read on it, if we look at something like 5.3 and the magics used by which are different magics, but the magics used by Elidibus, because he's using the magics that Graha used, makes me think that it's probably capable of pulling anyone who's willing and able, not necessarily just the people that you're friends with, but you may also have some direction to pull the people who you're allied with, as is done with when we're fighting before the fight with Medion in the meadows in at the end of 6.0, obviously in the Albus Flowers. I'm telling the guys that it's Dawntrail Saints of attending AetherCon. Otherwise, we'd not be able to follow this panel. Yeah, you were able to do this time for this. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, glad you were able to join. So it's not. Yeah, we never. Ascendance magic doesn't seem to work across time though, as proven in Pandemonium. Pandemonium's an interesting case, right? Because the thing. Here's the thing that's worth pointing out about Asm's magic and some other things in 14 is that sometimes they're more soft systems where just because they haven't been shown to have one capability doesn't mean that they're not capable of it given a certain context. But I would say it's probably likely that Asm's magic doesn't pull across time. But it's worth pointing out that since reflections, you can pull across reflections and they exist in different dilations of time, that's not the same thing, but it is interesting. Asm's magic doesn't need consent though. They summons need to answer your call by their choice. Um, I'm trying to think if we know that for sure. I mean, that's probably true with the science. I would suspect that's true. I just don't know. I go to really great lengths to distinguish between, and it's very important to do this in lore always, not just 14, but always. There's always make sure to distinguish between what you think is likely given the circumstantial evidence versus what has explicitly been stated as fact. You know, that's the entire thought. Philip tapping his head. No worries. Still got 5 minutes. Be an interesting post MSQ story, pulling people from something like that, but they actually react like, where am I, who are you? Look, I think there's a non-zero chance that the finale of this second arc and probably final arc of 14 ends with us calling all our allies across space to our sides from across the reflections all at once. Both, but the fact that the key exists, but also with the magics of them being what they are, and specifically the Warrior of Light within 7.0 acting as now less of the singular hero, and now we, at least within 7.0, are more of a mentor figure in a way that I really love and I think is interesting. I do think drawing everyone to our side for a climactic finale against some sort of enemy would be quite cool. An alternate answer: the ancients never achieved time travel magic. Yeah, time dilation, dial action magic, yes, but not outright reaching across time. Yeah. It's, no, that's a really good point. Or at least to the point that Emmett Selk, it's worth pointing out that they were not all aware of what every ancient was doing. For instance, most were not aware of what Athena was doing or capable of. However, I agree with your point. And Emmett Selk was clearly very knowledgeable and very marveled at the capability of the Crystal Tower, especially at the fact that it should not have had the capability it did. It's worth pointing out that at the same time, Elidibus had enough awareness to understand how to use the Crystal Tower to send us to Elpis. So there's some awareness of those magics at the very least. Wavelets and Stormblood in side quests. Yes, I mean more within the context of the MSQ. Dawntrail is the first time that it seems like our predominant role is not necessarily to be the main character. But that happened plenty of other times to greater or lesser extents. But yeah. Yeah, definitely worth. Otherwise, I would not be able to. Glad we were able to. Thank you for the great panel. Yes, we're running up on time, so definitely get in your final questions if everyone has any. If there's a connection to Azem and Azima, or do they just circumstance? Actually, the interesting thing is there's less likely a connection between Azem and Azima, and much likely, I mean, there is some nodded to connections with someone makes a point that Azima, I think, was a follower or at least a very ardent lover, like not literal lover, but appreciator of Azem, if I remember rightly, is one of the things that's told about us in the Omphalos. The other thing that's interesting, though, is Azim and Nama are actually much more likely to be references to Bahamut and Tiamat. There's a quite big possibility because they're the Dawn and Duskworm, and specifically the Dawnfather and Duskmother, and the Dawn and Dusk and Bahamut and Tiamat are the Dawn and Duskworm. So something interesting there. About dimensional compression, it's been referred in patch 2.0. Hey, nice, cool. So actually, there are some examples of it earlier on. FFA mentions time compression. Yeah. And Walker Rays explicitly pinpoint the exact connection between. Yes, okay, Infinite got it. Yep. Been mentor worth remembering. Okay. Zima is basically a Warrior of Light's Zima's successor in training, as far as I understood it. Yeah, that was my understanding as well. Okay, because we only have 3 minutes, I'm going to start winding up here. Again, friendly reminder, if you would like to join our Discord, you can join us discord.gg/heroes-and-archives. We'd love to have you. We talk about lore and do all sorts of events and stuff there. We'd also love to have you in our FC if you're on Crystal Curl. You can just ping me if you'd like an invite or know anyone who needs one. Obviously, you can check us over at the Origin Archives over on our YouTube channel. And if you want to subscribe to our T Live channel, that's where we do streams that may be a little bit more eclectic if they're like me just reading Encyclopedia Eorzea or us doing all the side quests rather than the main channel where we do things like the MSQ replays. But yeah, I want to thank you all guys for taking the time to stay here. I see we have, over 100 viewers, and we've got all this lovely people over here in the panel. I cannot thank you enough. This has been a pleasure. Hopefully I'll get a chance to do this next year, and maybe do something else. There's all sorts of things to talk about, because I will tell you, the lore in this game is rich and deep, and I do not stop enjoying it or being just constantly loving learning about it. And I love playing it with all you guys. So yeah. Let me do a little wave to y'all. Again, thank you all so much. And yes, and if you want to talk lore with me over on the Discord, all you have to do is ping me. I will gladly talk about all sorts of weird stuff. Also, I cannot recommend joining our lore book club. Great. We have 15 people or so, and we talk about all sorts of stuff. It's a good time. on your Twitter or YouTube. Just that's why you know, Dwarven, I may have accidentally deleted it. I should fix that. So I'll make sure to note that. I'm noting it here. Fix Discord links. But yeah, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your AetherCon and a whole wonderful rest of your Dawntrail. Don't forget, we've got a live letter coming out in like 4 or 5 hours here, maybe like more like 6 hours. Also, I will be live streaming that over on our channel if you want to check that out. Exciting times, guys. Exciting times. We got a whole Dawntrail is the second ARR. We got a whole history. We got a whole long arc ahead of us. Okay, I'm headed off. I've been Elioaux Forgerau. See you guys around, hopefully.